You're listening to Mystic Lounge with Alan B. Smith. Rebroadcast on the UnX Network. Thursdays at 11 p.m. Pacific. Fridays at 2 a.m. Eastern.
However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Mystic Lounge. I'm Alan B. Smith. Thank you for joining us tonight. I have a very special guest. His name is Loyd Auerbach, a world-recognized paranormal expert and parapsychologist. So tonight we'll be testing the limits of consciousness and what your potentiality might be. It's really interesting, very fascinating, and I want to send a special thanks to my friend Mariah Kunau for helping to make tonight happen. Love you, Mariah. Thank you so much. If you missed this stream, you can always catch it on a podcast version wherever you listen to podcasts, or on the UnX Network, where we'll rebroadcast Fridays 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Thursdays 11 p.m. Pacific Time. And of course, this is one podcast of two on this channel. So if you're much more into ufology, UFOs in particular, and that field of study, on the same channel, we also have Coffee and UFOs. And some of those recent guests include Gary Nolan, Dr. Gary Nolan, Dr. Robert Davis, Paula Harris, and Stephen Bassett, and so many more. I'm really lucky to have conversations with these very special and intelligent people. And I'm very lucky that you all join every week and you follow on the podcast, because I really appreciate your feedback and your questions. This is a place of growth. This is a podcast for, and I use this not in the new age way, expanding our consciousness and trying to be better people. And every time I come to this seat every week, it's kind of my, for lack of a better word, my church, let's say. It's my place that I come to that keeps my mind thinking about the next week, what topics are important that we should be covering that will help us all evolve as individuals, whether it's pursuing paranormal investigations, UFO investigations, or just our overall wellness. So thank you all for being here. Loyd Auerbach is a world-recognized paranormal expert and parapsychologist. He has 44 years of investigating the paranormal and over 40 years teaching courses in parapsychology. He is director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, president of the Forever Family Foundation, an adjunct professor at Atlantic University, and president of the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center, where he teaches online parapsychology courses through their education center. He's the author of 9 books on the paranormal. He is a professional mentalist and past president of the Psychic Entertainers Association, performing as Professor Paranormal, and also does his thing as an occasional chocolatier. And there's a meaning behind the chocolatier, which we'll talk to him about in just a moment. Currently, you can find him in episodes of the UnXplained and Surviving Death. Loyd, welcome to Mystic Lounge.
Thanks very much, Alan.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. So, I'm going to jump into this really quick. We're going to be talking about, obviously, all aspects of parapsychology. It's a very broad field of study, but it all centers around the mind and what the mind is capable of doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why chocolate?
Well, it's not directly related, although there is a little bit of relation in that I'm a food guy, and we used to call ourselves foodists with an HIST on there.
Not foodie.
Not foodie. No, we're foodists. And back living outside of San Francisco, we're in wine country. So all over the Bay Area is wine country. And I got introduced to some really good chocolate back in the 90s at a couple of wineries. This is when Scharfenberger started spreading across the country and really spurred on the artisan chocolate maker, milieu in chocolate making here in the States. So I'd never had great chocolate. And then I started really learning about it and eventually started doing some chocolate tastings for people. Started working on a book that one publisher had asked me to write a book about my journey. She unfortunately ended up selling the company and they didn't want the book. But in the process, I got to know a lot of chocolatiers and chocolate makers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them said, you got to take a course to learn how to make chocolate. So I got a certificate as a professional chocolatier
Mm-hmm.
through a school that is well known, renowned for doing that. And for a while, was making my own chocolate and selling it a little bit. Really didn't go all in. That's something I'm planning on for my retirement at some point. And that business is called Haunted by Chocolate, because I am.
But there is a consciousness connection here.
There is a consciousness. Yeah, Dean Radin, who is a well-known consciousness researcher and parapsychologist with the Institute of Neurotic Sciences years ago, back around, I think it was around 2005, did a pilot study based on the idea that food made with love is better for you, or will do something for you. So he had an experiment done with some chocolate from a company out in Hawaii, where there were 4 sets of the chocolate from one batch, and each set, there was one control set, nothing happened to it. The other 3 had different forms of intention, rituals, or prayer given to the chocolate, that this sample of chocolate would be more energizing and mood enhancing. And then a really unfortunate group of volunteers had to have some really good chocolate twice a day.
Just had to do it.
Fill out mood surveys. And it was all a double-blind study. And when Dean started analyzing the data, not knowing which group or which individual had which, there was a 67% mood enhancement that was recorded in one set of chocolate, and close in the other 2 that turned out to be above what that control sample was. So we do put something into our food. He did another study with tea, by the way. Same kind of study, same thing. So that also makes you, and something I think Dean pointed out, that means that the thing you don't want to eat is fast food produced by some teenager who hates his job.
Okay, well,
that'll be in the food.
I noticed something missing. Coffee.
Yeah, coffee has some. I don't know that Dean has done coffee, but absolutely. I mean, coffee. I'm a coffee guy too. I'm kind of hooked on one local roastery quite a bit. So,
well, Tyler Henry was on Mystic Lounge, and I asked him about coffee, and he said he actually gives better readings when he has a little bit of coffee before reading.
And I've known psychics, including somebody I worked with for years before she passed away, who I had recommended a really good dark chocolate to her, and she was doing that, eating a little bit right before every reading, and she said that everything was brighter and more colorful as she was doing the readings.
And Mariah's in chat. Mariah, if you're listening, I'm curious if you have any comment on coffee. I know you and I have talked about this, but I'd like to hear what you have to say now. So Loyd, what is it about our mind that initially caught your attention that was different than what you can learn in conventional studies?
So I've been interested in this subject of psychic phenomena since I was a little kid. I fortunately discovered, probably when I was about 12 or 13, the books on parapsychology by researchers that happened to be in the library in the same section of the Dewey Decimal System as vampires and werewolves and witchcraft.
It's funny, right?
Yeah. And what my growing up, I was and still am a comic book and science fiction nerd.
As we can tell behind you, right?
Yes, as you can tell, that's absolutely, you can tell that. You can see my Star Trek The Next Generation tarot cards right behind me, in fact, and my action figures. So I was coming at this topic from a perspective of human potential, because that's what's talked about in comic books and science fiction, not horror, which is where a lot of the ghost hunters seem to come from. And that put me on a different track altogether. I mean, really in the science track, and the idea that was hammered into me by the research and the findings of the research that I kept on reading, that we have more potential. Our consciousness has much more potential than the mainstream, but the world, what our cultures, it's not only science, it's culture in general, will tell us that we can do. And that and the fact that this was a mystery. I mean, what are these experiences? What causes them? Who are the best people to have them? Can we learn? All those questions, which we still look at in parapsychology, are mysteries. And I wanted to see if I could kind of contribute to solving those mysteries.
Well, since you brought up culture, let me ask you this. So religions often give us stories of individuals in the past, and usually in the far past, that had these abilities to do amazing things.
Right.
They also will say, well, you can commune with your higher power, whatever that is, and receive information from them. Why is all that possible? And yet they're not encouraging or practicing the exercise of our ability to exert activity rather than just being receptive of a mystical being or some ability that is long gone.
If you look cross-culturally, there are cultures around the world that have traditions of certain types of experiences and abilities that special people are born with and may apprentice to someone, but they accept, many other cultures and their religions accept various forms of psychic experience as normal. I mean, there's nothing paranormal in many cultures around seeing a ghost or having a premonition or reading people or things like that. It's all normal. And actually in our culture, it should be normal if you go by the numbers alone. Mm-hmm. Religion is a different situation because, there's a lot of fear in many religions. And yes, in the past of Christianity and a lot of other religions, there are special people chosen by God or gods to have these powers, but anyone else, no. You have to be special. In fact, some of the Catholic saints, people like St. Joseph of Cupertino, who was supposedly able to levitate and even fly a bit, had he not been in the clergy already, the odds are he probably would have been burned at the stake. So it's really a very biased system in many respects.
So it's not. So what we're getting at is it's not just about the scientific community having a bias. It's also what should be the mystical or religious spiritual community.
Well, yeah, and let's face it. There's not a lot of mysticism in many forms of the main religions today, and or spirituality for that matter, in some respects. And some of the religions have a real fear base to them where, I've spoken in places in the Bible Belt over the years in colleges and always had a few students in the class in the room. Fortunately, no protesters. So I know people who have been protested against telling me that, I'm perpetuating, the word of the devil, of Satan, and the whole bit that studying this stuff is evil, that psychics are evil. It's like, and then, I have really good ways of handling that, but it's something that is in the culture, in certain religions. It is actually put out there in pop culture as well. I mean, there are people I know, and a lot of the ghost hunting world, they tell you do not have a Ouija board in your house because it's going to bring in some evil spirits. I got a dozen. I got two sitting right next to me, right here in the room. It's a board with letters on it. It doesn't do anything. So,
what does that mean? Is it our mind that's doing it? What's happening when people make those claims that something's being conjured?
Well, in the case of the Ouija board, it's because they saw it in a movie called The Exorcist back in the 1970s. And yes, some people, there are stories floating around about teenagers who play with the Ouija boards and they say terrible things and the board flies across the room. And most of those, yes, the teenagers probably did say terrible things. I would put out there that it's probably one teenager who's basically trying to scare the others in that group. For the most part, I should know this. I did that to my friends when I was a teenager as well. I think a lot of us did. So the stories they're not real in that sense. The Ouija board's just a tool. Actually, when ghost hunters do EVP, they're asking for it for communication. That's what a Ouija board is. So
if an EVP is possible, why couldn't a Ouija board be?
Well, it can be. The difference is, first of all, they're asking for communication. So, if they're asking for communication, the Ouija board, and they're worried about getting evil spirits, they should worry about that when they're doing EVP also.
Yeah. Okay.
There's not really a difference. The difference, though, is that with the Ouija board, people have their fingers on a planchette on the pointer, and it's very similar to using a pendulum. It's something called the ideomotor response. If you're not consciously pushing it, the unconscious mind is actually moving it around. It is possible that your unconscious could get communication from a spirit if there is one, but it is much more likely that what you're getting is given the setting and what your intention is, you're getting a story. And the story is based on what you're hoping to get in that communication, not factual information.
Intention has a whole lot to do with all of this, doesn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I've heard you speak about, telekinesis or the ability to move things with your mind. I mean, Do you really think that is something that is achievable by, I don't know, some percentage of the population?
It's achievable in different ways by a lot of different people. Actually, I've years ago, back in the 90s, I worked with a gentleman by the name of Martin Caden, who was a science and science fiction writer. In fact, he more or less created the $6 Million Man. It was his book, Cyborg, that the show was based on.
Mm-hmm.
And Marty was able to move things. I mean, he did telekinesis. He did what we call psychokinesis under controlled conditions. Mm-hmm. He was also a consultant in NASA, and a bunch of his NASA buddies had him ran him through the ringer, more or less, under better control conditions. And we actually together did some workshops, and typically about half the people were able to move the objects throughout the various session. So it's about half of the people in that case. And I've done a bunch since Marty passed away, but also, there's the idea of the spoon bending party, the idea that, we can do metal bending.
Yeah.
And while some of what happens at those parties, those events tend to be people in altered states not realizing how much pressure they put on the spoons and forks and things. There are some indicators from metallurgists who have done analysis that many of the easy to bend, the unusual forms that have popped up, and including witnessed spoons and forks kind of flopping over, that there's changes in the metal structure itself at a visible level under a microscope, actually.
So then where's the controversy? Well, then where's the controversy with the likes of Uri Geller? Because remember the Johnny Carson bit?
Because
they staged him,
Yeah, I mean, you can fake it. It is not hard to fake it, and it doesn't happen all the time. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that is important to know about Uri, for example, about Geller, the controversy was really conjured up more by the amazing Randy than it was by Geller himself, and or anybody else around him. Mm-hmm. He's been able to do things under better controlled conditions. The fact is, though, if you were to ask, I'm not sure if you ask him right now, but I've met Uri a bunch of times. At one point, we were doing a Japanese TV show together, and I asked him on the show, "Are you a psychic?" And he said, "I'm an entertainer. Everybody's psychic." That was his response.
Yeah.
He started as an entertainer. He's been an entertainer the entire time. He's done motivational workshops also. So if you are an entertainer and you are capable of bending spoons psychically 90% of the time, what do you do with the 10% of the time that you have an audience? So it's kind of hard.
That's where the mentalist part comes in.
That's where the mentalism comes in. That's where magic might come in, things like that. Yeah. Okay. I know mentalists who have had flashes of insight and information about stuff that they don't even know. They say it out loud. If it pops into their head, because it could be real. And if it's not, it's okay, because ESP is not perfect. But 99 out of 100 times something like that happens, and somebody in the audience says, "That's my phone number," and the mentalist is like, "I have no idea where they came from."
So you've seen enough evidence to believe this is possible?
Yeah, for psychokinesis, absolutely. I mean, I wrote a book on it. The book is currently out of print, but there's plenty of copies floating around. It's called, no pun intended, it's called Mind Over Matter. I'll have it back out hopefully by the end of the year, or beginning of next year again. Cool. It also has Martin Caden's method on how to do PK to some extent. But one of the things about psychokinesis is it's scary to people. I've seen people who were able to move an object who back away once they see the object moving, and their eyes go wide and they back away and they can't do it again. And it's because our culture has made that particular ability, more than any ESP ability, weird, strange. We've seen terrible movies about people, causing terrible things with telekinesis. And we know that there's a psychology here more for PK than there is even for ESP, which is similar to performance psychology in sports and other activities. In fact, it's the same psychology in many respects.
If someone is exercising that ability, if they present it as, "I'm using the force," then there's nothing really scary about it, right? It's more.
That's actually how I tend to present it to people. Actually, that's part of the induction we do, is calling down the force.
I, on occasion, still give it a go. I give it a go once in a while, and I see maybe I can just concentrate, relax a little bit, and see if anything will budge. But don't
go to the dark side.
Yeah. So, well, you know what's interesting? The old Star Wars, right? Like Obi-Wan Kenobi says, let the Force flow through you. In in recent Star
Well,
Wars, I've noticed like a lot of people are straining really hard to get the Force to
yeah,
work for them.
yeah.
You know,
And
and I'm like, that's not.
what's really interesting, one of my colleagues, Pamela Ray Heath, years ago did her
Mhm.
doctoral dissertation on psychokinesis, and she looked at the experiences of a number of people who have had consistent or relatively common PK experiences, both spontaneous and controlled, and
Mhm.
found that there were some very common factors. One of which was you got to trust the process. So, and it's not what, in other words, if it's happening, you can trust that it's real. You can kind of
Mhm.
go into it, but you shouldn't try to force it. We're talking about the force, but this is a different kind of force here.
Sure. Yeah.
And what's really interesting is watching people do PK, even at these PK parties, is
Mhm.
when the spoon bending is actually happening or objects are moving for
Mhm.
these folks. Their faces go blank. They are not straining. They're not getting that red faced throbbing vein in the head, which is all about pop culture.
Mhm.
It's all about the movies and TV to kind of produce an emotion in the audience as well. So it's not about concentrations. It is about
Mhm.
focus, and it is about letting it flow. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah. When not Obi-Wan, oh my gosh, and Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon Jinn. Yeah, when he's facing Darth Maul, right? And he has that moment where he just gets down on his knees, he closes his eyes because he has the time to do it, to relax and clear his head. And other psychics that I've spoken to, that seems to be what they do.
Yeah, yeah,
It's about kind of clearing and getting out of your own way, and letting it happen.
yeah. I mean, actually, one of the most common things we hear about these days is remote viewing, and one of the books that I wrote, co-authored actually, called ESP Wars, East and West, is about the U.S. government's remote viewing program. Two of the folks who are co-authors were heavily involved in the program itself,
Mhm.
but also we have contributions from the Russians. It's the only book that actually covers the Russian side of things as well.
Yeah.
In remote viewing, the main thing, or any ESP task that you're doing, the main thing is to get out of your own way, to not categorize, to not analyze, to not second guess.
Mhm.
You can always do that later. You get the impression and the information first, and then you decode or go over it later on. So having Joe McMoneagle, who is one of the best known remote viewers from that program, who still does remote viewing, has said that he just basically had to learn to move his ego aside. The I goes away.
Okay.
It's the information. That's the only I that we're talking about here.
How much control can you have then if you're kind of setting all that aside and you're operating almost in a semi-unconscious state?
Well, ESP tends to be more unconscious. In other words, the information comes in and bubbles up from our unconscious. So it's really more about noticing what is already there or
Okay.
coming through.
Mhm.
Our normal perceptions, people always talk about, how come I don't get more psychic information? It's, well, because the fact is that most people who have a quick psychic flash or insight, it's very mundane.
Mhm.
It's like the shiny object in your perceptions most of the time. But
Okay.
we have so many shiny objects that are taking our attention from our normal senses that unless that information is different than what our senses provide, it could actually be enhancing one of our normal senses or inputs, and we wouldn't
Mhm.
even know it, because we just noticed something that we hadn't noticed by looking in that direction, and it's our psychic sense pointing us in that direction. ESP is non-sensory. It really should have been called non-sensory perception, because it's not an extra sense. The whole idea of calling this a sixth sense,
Mhm.
sensory information or sensory input requires a sense organ or a part of you that actually picks up the data. We look at ESP as
Mhm.
non-sensory, that it's a function of consciousness actually getting the information directly.
Did you see Caroline Corey's Superhuman documentary?
I did see it when it first was produced. Yeah.
I remember in there was a scene where they had this. It was like a gum wrapper that was kind of placed like on the top, like a tip of something very sharp, and it was covered, so presumably no air would drift through. And they were concentrating on trying to get this thing to move, and it did appear to move. Now, granted, it's an edited documentary, right? And I've spoken to Caroline, and I don't think she's trying to deceive anyone.
Well, I mean, what you're describing, though, is pretty much what Martin Caidin was able to do with not just gum wrap, just pretty much any kind of balanced pyramid, if you want to call it a paper pyramid, or but he actually was using all sorts of stuff, and he had a very closed system that he was seeing outside of in order to watch this. And in fact, one of the tests that was done with him was having that target in an atmosphere chamber. It was actually an archery company that produces arrowheads and things like that, and they had a vacuum chamber. They lowered the atmospheric pressure to less than 1/100th of an atmosphere. So even if, and they even had a fan, a remote controlled fan in that chamber blowing directly on the target, and it didn't move because there wasn't enough air to move that.
Okay. Yep.
So, and Marty was able to still cause that to move.
Okay. So something like that occurs, right?
Yeah.
Why are not scientists the likes of Neil deGrasse Tyson, Michael Shermer, why do they not look at these things and go, whoa, wait a minute, there's something here?
Because they don't trust or believe, it's a belief thing, that this is even possible. Not when there's a possibility of microcurrents of air, which is the main thing that's suggested, that every once in a while could move something around. And even in a closed system, you put a dome over something and you seal that dome and you've got that target inside. It would be really important to observe it with no attempt to move it for quite some time to see if it moves from ostensible microcurrents of air, changes in temperature, things like that. Then the question is, if someone sits down in front of that, does that cause any sort of temperature differential or electrostatic differential that causes it to move? Again, you do some observation. Then you ask the person to make it move or to focus on it. And if it moves at that point, and then you tell them to ask it to stop, and it stops, and then you observe it some more with that person sitting there and it's not moving, you have to really look at that as a good experiment. The problem is that if you're approaching this, that PK is impossible, then you're not even going to consider any other option. You're not going to look at that as a mystery. You're going to think it's a fraud. You're going to think it's a trick of, it's vibration, it's temperature, it's all sorts of other possibilities. But if it's not that hard to eliminate most, if not all of those other possibilities from that scenario. They're just not interested.
But these are people that profess objectivity.
Well, there's clearly no objectivity in science. I mean, one of the best examples happened when Daryl Bem, who is a social psychologist at Cornell University, when he had done a couple of year study on precognition using something called presentiment, looking at the biometrics of a person's body, the subject's bodies, as they were presented with images, many neutral, and then there were actually porn images, sexual images that were shown. In fact, he was on the Colbert Report talking about the psychic porn thing. Stephen Colbert called it that, the psychic porn study. But his study was announced to be presented in a journal, mainstream psychology journal. And when the table of contents came out, there was an enormous backlash at the journal. How dare they consider publishing something on precognition? Precognition is not real. So a number of reporters actually asked these well-known scientists why they're making these comments, and the answer was it's not possible, or the results can't be there. And consistently, the reporters were often asking, have you read the study? And the answer was no.
Yeah.
Why would I? That's what we're dealing with here.
Okay, so then what's the next step? How do you eventually tip the scale where they can no longer be in a state of denial?
Well, it's not the case with all scientists. The problem is coming to the attention of scientists who might be willing to consider these questions, to look at what's really going on, because, we all want to find an explanation. And it's not that, we certainly were hoping that we're right about the ESP and PK thing. We still want to know how they work, but it may be that we're wrong, that there's something that we don't know in the way we interact with the universe that on a physical basis that has not been discovered by science yet. Sadly, parapsychologists are the only ones who are going to find that out, because these other folks are unwilling to look at this question. So we have to find people who are willing to express publicly, or at least do research on the sly,
Mhm.
which happens quite a bit, by the way, in academics.
After hours in the lab.
After hours in the lab, doing it at their houses, something else.
Yeah.
You know, there are dozens of situations over the years where I've met people from different universities or in academia in some way, and they will, in a group, they'll clear it, or with somebody else from their department or their company will say, this stuff is all garbage. And then they'll pull you aside and they say, oh, I got to tell you my ghost story. Dean Braden has talked about that. I think everybody in my field has met people in other groups of academia that have said that. The problem is there's such a bias publicly against this subject. And so much of it was promoted by the pseudo-skeptics. They call themselves skeptics. They're not skeptics. Neil deGrasse Tyson around this subject is a pseudo-skeptic. He's not, they're not skeptics because they're not looking into the question. They may not care, which is fine. If they just simply said, I don't care about this, I'd be okay with that.
I'm uninterested, but
uninterested is fine. That is a reasonable thing to say. But to say that there's nothing to it, or coming up with explanations that without knowing what the studies actually are. I mean, BEM's study, those scientists who made comments like that didn't even know if BEM had a significantly positive result because they hadn't read the study. It turned out he did. So then what happened? They looked at his, there was a whole bunch of people who were going after him for doing his statistics wrong, for gathering the data wrong. Well, some of the top statisticians and people in statistical work in psychology looked at what he had done and concluded that everything he did was correct. But if ESP doesn't exist, that means there's something wrong with the method of statistics. This has actually caused a kind of a crisis in psychology and social science in general, because the method he used, Daryl Bem's an amazingly well-known social psychologist. Bayesian statistics, which is the basics for social psychology, or psychology in general for many other social sciences. If there's something wrong with Bayesian statistics because ESP can't exist, they got to throw out hundreds of studies, which they're unwilling to do. Therefore, what do you say? I mean, do you say ESP must be possible? They're not saying that.
No, they go, we'll deal with that later. Kind of like they do with in archaeology, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why this is in this strata. So let's just put that in a box back here and we'll worry about that another day.
Right.
Yeah.
Until the next big study comes along.
Right. So we're talking about the psychokinesis and telekinesis, right? So it seems to me that whatever has been measured is very subtle, very, very small movements of force. And why do you think that is? Why is it so subtle?
Well, it's really interesting. There's a problem with psychokinesis, and it is an issue that connects to our psychology in some way, shape, or form. And the problem, PK has often been called the trickster phenomenon, because when you try to measure, so for example, in the moving targets that we described when we were working with Martin Caden, and I know this was a baffling thing for some of the other researchers who were not parapsychologists who had worked with Marty on the sly, only because he knew a lot of guys at NASA. They would measure for temperature change in the jar or in the controlled environment. Okay. And it would go up 1 degree, like once it would go up 1 degree.
A degree is actually pretty significant.
It is. And that was because he had his hands on the outside of the jar. But the interesting thing is that at one point he made his hands really hot, put them on the outside of the jar, it went up 2 degrees. The target didn't move. So it didn't cause a change in the airflow.
I see. Okay.
All right. But we were trying to measure, was there or that? Another time we would be measuring and we'd have a device to detect electrostatic fields. Okay. Because the human body can generate electrostatic fields, and actually pretty powerful ones. Not consciously, but we can do that. We do generate electrostatic fields. An electrostatic field can move an object. We got it once, we didn't get it the next time. We got it the third time, we didn't get it the fourth time. It's almost as if, and this I've heard from other researchers, that it's almost as if whatever is, if there's an easy way, what in that moment, is it easier to send a force out of your head to make it move, to cause the air to move, to cause a temperature change, to generate an electrostatic field, to move a few molecules that kind of line up like dominoes that eventually cause the object to actually move, something called Brownian motion in the atmosphere. There's any number of reasons. And it's not consistent. And that makes it harder to study. It doesn't make it harder to control for, because we are trying to figure out what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as a person can't manipulate, we just need to know what the body is producing.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I had a conversation with a good friend of mine, Ed May, who was actually trained as a nuclear physicist and ended up being the program director of the Stargate program, the government program. Still does remote viewing and other research. He's done PK research, doesn't really buy into it too much. But he was talking to me about this electrostatic field. The body can generate this field. And partly that was because the Russians had found that with one of their well-known psychics, she was generating an electrostatic field to move objects. They measured that fairly consistently, in fact, with her. And Ed said, well, that's not PK. And I said, well, can you do that consciously?
Yeah.
I mean, psychokinesis is mind over matter. It doesn't matter how we do that, as long as we're not picking it up and moving it that way.
And you said earlier, brownie in motion?
Brownie in motion.
How do you spell that, brownie?
Like brown, I-A-N.
I-A-N, okay.
Yeah. That was a very simplistic version of that, brownie in motion, yeah. And that's something Ed also meant, as a physicist, he talked about that being a possibility too. There was apparently a couple of papers out about that.
Well, that's what it sounds like to me, right? So you're saying that static electricity could be the function.
Right, but how does the body, how does the brain, how does the mind generate that on an unconscious level to actually target a specific object?
But we do send electrical signals from our brain already.
Internally, yeah. Those are electrochemical.
Right.
That's not the same as electrostatic fields.
So so electrochemical, the brain can do that. But the question is, can the brain do electrostatic? Well, I mean, we do. Again, right? we naturally, we have, consciously, intentionally.
Yeah, consciously is the big question.
Right.
There's a generally accepted, well accepted effect. It's accepted in medicine, and it's accepted. In fact, it's a benchmark in pharmaceutical research called the placebo effect. There is extremely little research on how the placebo effect actually works. That's a mind over matter thing.
And I don't understand that, because there's enough data that even your everyday doctor will agree that the placebo effect is a real thing.
Right.
Why aren't we spending millions more? Why don't we have commissions and studies to figure out what's going on here? Because we might be able to unlock something through this avenue.
Correct. That is correct.
Yeah.
That's not something the pharmaceutical companies want you to do, though. There's also, and it's noted actually more in anthropology and then any other areas, there is a reverse of the placebo effect called the nocebo effect, which we often call a psychosomatic effect. A good example of that, which is rare, but it does happen with highly suggestible, hypnotizable people, where you tell them that a pen is a red hot iron poker. Once they're under, you touch their skin and they get a blister. There is literally no reason why that should happen.
Sure. And yet we know it does.
And we know it does. That's a nocebo effect. Yeah.
Yeah. Nocebo, which is psychosomatic.
Right. Nocebo, like the placebo effect, but placebo means positive. Nocebo is negative. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So now that's kind of like when you stub your foot in the morning and you start off your day cranky and upset, and you say it's a bad day, and then the rest of the day it's just one thing after another after another.
That's a real psychological conundrum in many respects. It's why people sometimes think they're unlucky or cursed.
Right, but you can physically feel drained at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are those two things completely separate, or is there a connection there? Is it one purely psychological, one
psychological? And the question is what kind of effect you're having on your body. I mean, our minds absolutely have an effect on our bodies. That mind-body connection is studied in different ways all over the place. Not everybody in my field would approach this. Many of us actually look at self-healing as a form of psychokinesis as well. It still is, by definition, mind over matter or mind-matter interaction. But our psychology affects our health, our attitudes affect our health, our moods, all that. That's all connected. It's all totally connected. The question is, can we, and I think a lot of that's accepted, although under a different concept, by people who are absolutely against the idea of psychokinesis or ESP or anything else. So for them, the hard part is going beyond the body. If the extension of our thought goes beyond the body without the body being involved in doing something physically. That's where the problem is.
And we've measured electrostatic frequency during these events.
I mean, people have been able to generate. I mean, we generate electrostatic fields in some respects. A simple example is how much static is generated during dry winter days, and you touch something metal and you get that spark.
Right, but you know how we measure our brain activity, right? And we can see the changes.
Yeah, they can measure electrostatic fields coming off the body. Yeah.
Okay, so we would be able to see divergent behavior or activity.
Yeah, you'd have to have constant monitoring because we have various fields coming off the body. I mean, for one thing, we have infrared energy coming off of us. I love talking to the pseudo-skeptic or the skeptics who say when psychics talk about energy or seeing an aura, I've heard some of them say, well, you can't see energy. There's no energy coming off you. And of course, they don't understand. So there are a couple, I love saying to them, well, then you must be dead, because if you're at all above, room temp or even below, if you're giving off infrared energy because you have temperature heat,
right?
Infrared energy.
Haven't there been studies where, or at least preliminary studies, where people can kind of see things without using their eyes? Is that?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's that. I mean, that's kind of almost a form of sonar, like what bats use. There have been people who have been able to learn to navigate through echolocation.
Okay.
And echolocation is what bats use. In other words, click. And I think what they do is they have this deep click that they learn how to do. And there have been a few blind people who have been able to do that too. It's something that can be learned by human beings, which really boggles the mind when you think about it, that we could actually navigate that way, navigate the world that way.
I have a question from Mariah Canal, and I'd like to kind of shift gears too, because I am curious about the spirit world. How does he feel spirits may affect EMF detectors, a potential similar way the living does?
Well, there are the general EMF sensor that you see on ghost hunting shows that we call a Gauss meter. The type that you typically buy is not going to be affected by humans at all, because they're basically designed to detect the kind of electromagnetic fields that are given off by technology.
Okay.
So they were actually originally designed on a consumer level. They were designed first for electromagnetic pollution, because a lot of people have been, still there's concern about living under power lines for potentially causing cancer.
Yeah.
So they don't pick up from humans. There are different forms of electromagnetic field detectors that will pick up more natural fields, and we do interact with the natural fields around us. I mean, there are electromagnetic fields here all around me. There are signals going through me from Wi-Fi and everything else. There is a geomagnetic field from the Earth that is here. And because we have the ability, it's not even an ability, because of our presence, we're interacting with that electromagnetic environment that's here. So we can cause, in these field detectors that detect natural fields, we can cause changes if we even wave our hand above the object. It's kind of like waving your hand through water. It's detecting the movement of the water in that sense. So it is thought that spirits might affect the electromagnetic environment, including those devices that might pick up from technology as well. Because one of the things we also know is that human beings seem to be able to affect technology, again, through PK. The big question for a lot of these meters, and it's a question I've had since I started using one years ago, because what we're doing is not trying to detect spirits. I mean, this was taken by the TV shows and by ghost hunting groups, that the sensors that we have been using, and there's basic sensors we use in parapsychology doing investigations that are environmental sensors, temperature, electromagnetic fields, things like that. Because when somebody sees a ghost, when Mariah, for example, sees somebody, I want to know if there's been a change in the environment.
Right. Yeah.
Because that'll tell me something. I don't know exactly what yet, but at least tells me that if there is a spirit there, they are interacting with the environment in some way. It may not be picking them up. I may be picking up the changes that they're making. That's what we think is going on. But the other side of that is if living humans can affect devices, then so potentially could spirits, right? So some of them have little needles that go back and forth. And I always used to kid about, because that's the original ones you had. I used to kid that the ghost is just walking over to the, moving over to the object and just flicking their fingers, their fingers on the needle to make it move. They're not causing a change in the electromagnetic field. And we don't know what's actually going on. We're seemingly measuring a change in the field, but we don't know if that's actually going on. And it's also possible that I'm doing it.
Well, that's making the assumption that the spirit is real. What evidence have you seen that makes you believe that there is a consciousness separate from the corporeal, state?
Well, first we have, I don't know how many thousands of cases on record going back to the late 1800s, actually even before that. The field got started in 1882 officially.
Okay.
And there's a common thread. There are patterns that we look at. People experience apparitions in certain ways, and it's very, very common. I mean, it really kind of fits a pattern straight across. As far as communication, you might see a figure or perceive, because not everybody sees ghosts. Some people hear the voice. Some people sense a presence. Some people smell the perfume or cologne. And that can happen with a group of people in the same room at the same time. That not everybody is experiencing that apparent ghost the same way.
Okay.
Because we are getting information and we process it. I might do it visually. Someone else might do it auditorily. Somebody else might do it some other way. And some people don't experience it at all. But it's the actual common factors of description matching someone the person could not have known that we look at quite often. It is the experiences people have where at the moment of death or shortly there, like within a few minutes after, they experience something from their Uncle Harry, and then the next morning they find out that he died at that time. And they had no idea he was sick, or he had no idea he died in an accident, for that matter. So we have a variety of cases of witnessed, experienced, multiple witness, sometimes really good information that's provided by the communication, coupled with, of course, the evidential mediumship work that many of the mediums have been certified and tested over the years, and actually going back in time. That all kind of gives us a really good set of evidence.
Well, you're a mentalist, right?
Right.
So you are very good at observation. You look at human behavior. So are you able to look at someone who says, I'm a psychic, and get a sense of whether they are misguided, sincere and true, or a charlatan?
I need them to demonstrate. I can't look at somebody and tell you if they're, well, let's put it this way. If they showed up in, gypsy in what was pop culture gypsy garb, not what gypsies actually wore, or with a Swami type thing, I might immediately make a judgment, snap judgment on that person.
Okay.
But I need them to demonstrate. There are many ways that people can glean information from someone, or whether it's fishing for information or using stock statements. But there are actually some good nonverbals if people are good at nonverbal communication, if they learn that very well. One of my mentalist buddies is also a professor at a university and teaches nonverbal communication. And he's exceptionally good at reading people that way. There are other ways you can read people as well. So we need to see specific types of behavior to determine if the person is psychic. And, I have to say that some of the best readers I've met are not psychic, but they are such good observers and, of nonverbals and everything else, that they do better than psychics when it comes to personality and things like that. They can't tell you the specifics about your life outside of you, but they can tell you a lot of good stuff. And then there are people who are very sincere. They've been told all their lives that they're psychic, but in fact they're not. Everybody told them they must be psychic. But there's also people who genuinely get information they could not possibly have known.
Right, that's the clincher. Right, that's where there's no denying. And that's in the we'll go back to Tyrell Henry briefly, when he did that study with Dr. Drew Pinsky on his television show. I think it was Dr. Andrew Pinsky, They did an EEG of his brain, right?
Right.
And they brought in someone who was a skeptic. And, as often happens, they're dumbfounded by the end of the reading. And they're left with no other choice to either say, I can't say he's not real, or I believe. And that's astounding. And then I remember during that study, they were studying the wavelengths, like the delta brain waves. And is there something we should be looking for, a consistency between different individuals who have this ability as far as their brain waves go?
There's nothing that's really come together yet. I know that there are folks like Jeffrey Tarrant and a few others who are doing studies, brainwave and other types of brain studies, mainly with mediums, because they're able to turn it on and off much better than psychics seem to be. Otherwise, other psychics can. And one of the things we do know right off the bat is that there is a difference in the brain state of that individual when they're ostensibly communicating with spirit, as opposed to even some mediums do psychic readings of living people. Not all mediums do that, but there's a difference for those who can also do psychic readings of living people, or say they can. And a difference, again, if they were just simply having a conversation with somebody, the researcher, or even if they were pretending to do a reading, acting it out, that there's a different brain state. So when a skeptic says, or I have to say pseudo-skeptic again, because they're not even really curious, they're just simply denying.
I like pseudo-skeptic. I've also used the word, malintended debunker.
That's a good one. Cynic is another good word that's used. Yeah. So, when they say there's nothing to it, or usually they say all mediums are phonies or frauds. It's like, yeah, you can't fake that. I'm sorry. You can't fake what's going on in the brain.
The movie Phenomenon is, I love that movie. I don't know if you remember that, with John Travolta.
Oh yeah.
From the 90s, 90s, the golden era of cinema, as my wife and I often joke. There's just some great gems that came out of that period. But in that movie, he has a tumor, right? And they attribute that to his psychic ability. Obviously, that's not what is required for someone to have psychic abilities. But I know that Tyler Henry did have a cyst in his brain that he had lived with for a while. And have you seen any evidence at all that any kind of I want to say malformation. Obviously I don't know the right term, but anything abnormal in the brain that could contribute to increased activity leading to psychic abilities?
There's nothing that has been noted across the board. There are people who have had issues with their brain, but there are also people who have had other kinds of trauma. I've met mediums and psychics who had a traumatic upbringing, not psychically, but otherwise. And it was that trauma that caused them to kind of go inward. And then others who were psychic as kids, which kids are often psychic before they learn not to be, where the parents encouraged it, and they didn't have that kind of trauma whatsoever. Maybe they were traumatized when they tried to talk to their friends in school about it, but they didn't have the kind of trauma these other ones did. We're all individuals, and there's not one way to become psychic out there. Tons of books on psychic development, but when it comes right down to it, there's some key elements right in the center that a lot of them cover, but they approach it differently because of their own personal experience. That's what the way psychics talk about it. So it really depends on the individual. And we really point to this as being a function of consciousness, whatever that is. When we talk about survival of bodily death, apparitions, ghosts, things like that, or reincarnation cases, we're talking about consciousness surviving, being able to be existing on its own without the supporting brain in some way, shape, or form. So, one of the things I always tell my students is, have you ever thought about how a ghost can see you? They don't have eyes. They look like they have eyes, but they don't have a retina. They don't have eardrums that are responding to sound. So they would have to use essentially psychic perception, ESP, to perceive the world around them and to communicate. So that is one other indication. If you go in the direction of dualism and consciousness existing without the body, that really says that ESP's got to be a function of consciousness. And if they can move something, they don't have hands, physical hands to move that object. Again, that's a mind over matter thing.
Are you familiar with the bicameral mind theory?
Yeah, Julian Jaynes.
Julian Jaynes, yeah.
Yeah.
So
A little bit. It's been a while.
It's the idea that back in the day, human brains were a little bit different, and that we really truly believed that like mythological gods were real because the way our right side of our brain would kind of communicate to us in a voice, and we would literally kind of hear the voice from the right brain to the left brain, and we would think this is a god talking to us, but really it was just our own mind. Do you think that's just a way out there hypothesis, or do you think there's something to it?
I think there's some form of it is something to it. I know that over the last probably 10 or 15 or even 20 years, there's been a whole lot of backing away from the right brain, left brain model, and more of a kind of cohesive brain model where we might have tendencies we used to attribute to right brain, and we can still use it as a way of talking about the creative side versus the logical side that we all have. But and there's some evidence, some discussion in anthropology I've seen over the years that points to things like development of art and the way it's developed in different cultures, even the development of language and written language and other things that may have shaped the brain also, because neural pathways form based on, as you're growing up, based on certain activities as well.
Sure.
So it may be that the brain did change and evolve for people in general, as we got more and more into tool making, into art and music and other things that kind of shaped in the culture itself, shaping our brains to some extent. But that's still really, we don't have actual brain matter from the ancient Egyptians, just really dried stuff. If you can find it in a canopic jar, in a tomb or something like that.
Yeah, and we would really need to see the full structure to be able to understand it. I think.
Right. That's right. That's right. I'm just noticing somebody mentioned the pineal gland, which is often called in various mystical beliefs and cultures the third eye.
Yeah.
And if you go back, I remember reading about the pineal gland in the 1960s in a comic book and looking it up and finding that they didn't think much of it in science. It was pretty much like the appendix, that we didn't need it, but we really need it.
There were a lot of assumptions of things we thought we didn't need.
Yeah.
We do need them. It's like junk DNA, right? There's probably a lot more going on there than we suspect. I have to ask you this. We're running out of time. So since this is the Mystic Lounge channel and we talk about UFOs and extraterrestrials, do you have any experience with anyone who has a psychic ability who feels that they can sense any other kind of non-human intelligence, not a ghost like someone who died or passed away, but something else that's out there?
Well, I mean, other than a few people I've met over the years who sense what they call angels, and Annette Martin, who I worked with for quite a long time, would use that language, even though what she was really referring to was helper spirits from the other side, the people who used to be alive and evolved. But there's often talk about various non-human entities, especially when people start talking about demons and things like that, which we really don't buy into in parapsychology. It is possible that there are conscious somethings out there that, and I'm not even talking about ETs at this point, that can interact with us in some way. We have no way of even indicating that they're real, because we know that when people experience what we say are actual ghosts that can be identified later on, people call them demons if they didn't like, the behavior, if they got scared and they were clearly not demonic or anything like that. So it's really hard to judge given the labels people put on this. I know when I was in college, J. Allen Hynek was the head of the astronomy department at Northwestern. I actually started as an astronomy major and volunteered at the Center for UFO Studies. And he often talked about not all UFOs being nuts and bolts hardware, that many of them may be psychic projections, kind of like what Carl Jung talked about. So whether that also means we're projecting somehow that there's other intelligence and it's really us, that's a question we have to ask ourselves.
That's a philosophical inquiry that Whitley Strieber has been trying to crack, for decades now. And he's still working away at that, trying to understand, is there a way to parse this out? Is there a way to separate a psychic phenomena from what seems to be a physical phenomenon, at least for him and others? I mean, that's a really fascinating place, because what if it is something in between that we just really can't quite conceive of yet. Loyd, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. And where can people find out more about you? And do you have any events or anything coming up you'd like to share?
Sure. Well, people can find out about me. Probably the easiest thing right now is my Facebook author page. It's facebook.com/loyd.auerbach.author. Do note the spelling of my first name, though, on that. You can also follow me on Twitter at Prof Paranormal. I have a YouTube channel, new YouTube channel, which is at Ask Professor Paranormal every other week starting. I've done 2 already. I'm doing one on the 23rd of July. It's on Sunday evenings. And we post the date and time for the next one there. It's, again, youtube.com/ask Professor Paranormal, or just go to youtube.com/Loyd Auerbach, and you'll see a lot of my TV appearances.
Loyd, thank you so much. One last question for you, and I think it's an important one. Are dragons real?
It depends on how you define dragons, doesn't it?
I suppose it does. All right. Do you want to leave it at that?
Yeah, I'm just going to leave it like that.
Okay. Loyd, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Alan.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I appreciate all of you as well. And of course, if you like this program, please subscribe, comment down below, share your thoughts and questions, and click the notification bell so you don't miss future shows. Until next time, peace and love to you all, and I will see you on the flip side.